Continuing where I left off, congratulations on her name day to our dear one and her children, she said in a loud, deep voice that drowned out all others. And what about you, you old sinner, she said to the Count, who was kissing her hand. Bored here in Moscow, I suppose. Nowhere to hunt with the dogs. What's to be done, my friend? You see how these fledglings are growing up. And she pointed to the girls. Like it or not, you'll have to start looking for bridegrooms. Well, how's my Cossack? Marya Dmitrievna always called Natasha the Cossack, she said, stroking the arm of the girl who had gaily and intrepidly come forward to kiss her hand. I know she's a scamp, but I love her. She took out her enormous reticule, a pair of pear-shaped earrings set with precious stones, and after giving them to Natasha, who was flushed and beaming on her name day, she immediately turned away and addressed herself to Pierre. My dear. Now you just come here, she said, affecting a high, gentle voice. Come right here, my dear. And she threateningly tucked up her sleeves still higher. Pierre approached, naively peering at her through his spectacles. Come on, come closer, my dear. I used to be the only one to tell that father of yours the truth in the days when he was a court favorite, and now it's my sacred duty to do the same for you. She paused. All remained silent in expectation of what was to follow, sensing that this was only the prelude. A fine fellow, to be sure, a fine fellow. His father is on his deathbed, and he amuses himself by mounting a policeman on a bear. For shame, sir, for shame. You have done better to go to war. She turned away and gave her hand to the Count, who could hardly keep from laughing. Well, I expect it's time we went into the diner, isn't it? Said Marya Dmitrievna. The Count went in first with Marya Dmitrievna, followed by the Countess on the arm of a colonel of the Hussars, a man who was important to them because he was to accompany Nikolai to his regiment. Anna Mikhailovna went in with Shinshin. Berg gave his arm to Vera. The smiling Jewy Karadina went to the table with Nikolai. Other couples followed, extending the entire length of the dining room. Then, one by one, the children, tutors, and governess drew up at the very end. There was a bustling of footmen, a scraping of chairs, and the Count's private orchestra struck up in the gallery as the guests took their places. The music soon gave way to the clatter of knives and forks, the buzz of voices, and the muffled footsteps of the waiters. At one end of the table sat the Countess with Marya Dmitrievna on her right and Anna Mikhailovna on her left, and the rest of the ladies farther down. At the other end sat the Count with the colonel of the Hussars on his left and Shinshin on his right, then the other male guests. The young people sat on one side of the long table, Vera beside Berg, Pierre next to Boris, and across from them the children with their tutors and governess. From behind the crystal decanters and bowls of fruits, the Count kept glancing at his wife in her high cap, with pale blue ribbons, as he diligently filled his neighbor's glasses, not forgetting his own. The Countess, too, without neglecting her duties as a hostess, darted significant glances from behind the pineapples at her husband, the redness of whose face and bald spot struck her as contrasting more sharply than usual with his gray hair. There was a steady babble of voices at the ladies' end of the table, while the men's voices kept growing louder, especially that of the colonel of the Hussars, who, becoming more and more flushed, ate and drank so much that the Count held him up as an example to the others. Berg, smiling tenderly at Vera, was telling her that love is a heavenly, not an earthly emotion. Boris was explaining to his new friend Pierre who the guests at the table were, and exchanging glances with Natasha, who sat opposite. Pierre spoke little, examined the new faces, and ate a great deal. Of the two soups offered at the beginning of the meal, he chose turtle with fish pasties, going on to the hazel hen without refusing a single dish or a single wine that the butler mysteriously thrust forward from over his neighbor's shoulder in napkin-wrapped bottles, murmuring, "Dried Madeira, Hungarian, Rhine wine." Pierre held out a random one of the 4 crystal glasses with the Count's monogram that stood at each place, and drank with zest, gazing with ever-increasing amiability at the other guests. Natasha, who sat opposite, gazed at Boris as any girl of 13 looks at a boy she's in love with and has just kissed for the first time. The same look sometimes fell on Pierre, and under the gaze of this droll, lively little girl, he felt like laughing without knowing why. Nikolai sat at some distance from Sonia, besides Julie Karagina, to whom he was again talking with the same unconscious smile. Sonia wore a company smile, but was visibly tormented by jealousy. Blushing and turning pale by turn, she strained every nerve in an effort to overhear what Julie and Nikolai were saying to each other. One of the governors kept looking about uneasily, as if ready to rebuff anyone who took it into his head to offend the children. The German tutor was trying to remember all the various kinds of dishes and the wines and desserts in order to send a delighted description to his family in Germany, and was greatly offended when a butler with a bottle and a napkin passed him by. He frowned, trying to look as though he had not wanted any of that particular wine, but was mortified to think that no one would realize that he wanted the wine not to quench his thirst or out of greediness, but from a conscientious desire for knowledge. Chapter 16. At the men's end of the table, the talk grew more and more animated. The colonel told them that the declaration of war had already appeared in Petersburg, and that a copy of the manifesto, which he himself had seen, had that day been delivered by courier to the commander-in-chief. "And why the devil are we going to fight Bonaparte?" asked Shinshin. "He's already made Austria sink small. I'm afraid it may be our next turn." The colonel, a tall, thick-set Sanguine German, was evidently an old Campier and Russian patriot. He took offense at Shinshin's remark. "It is for the reason, my dear sir," he began, speaking with a German accent, "for the reason that the Emperor knows this. In the manifesto he has said that he cannot view with indifference the danger threatening Russia, and that the safety of the empire, its dignity, and the sanctity of its alliances," he said, with particular emphasis on the word alliances, as if therein lay the whole point of the matter, and with the unerring memory for official matters that was characteristic of him. He repeated the introductory words of the manifesto. "And the desire which constitutes the sovereign soul and irrevocable aim, to establish peace in Europe on a firm foundation, has now brought him to the decision to dispatch part of the army across the frontier, thereby implementing new endeavors toward the achievement of this purpose. That, my dear sir, is the reason," he concluded didactically, and tossing off a glass of wine, he looked to the Count for approval. "Do you know the old saying, 'Yoroma, Yoroma, you better stay home. The fences you mend should be your own'?" inquired Shinshin, furrowing his brow and smiling. "That's fit. It's perfectly. Why, even Sovarov was beaten all hollow. And where will we find a Sovarov today? I ask you," he said, continually shifting from Russian to French. "We must fight to the last drop of blood," said the colonel, pounding on the table, "and die for our emperor. Then all will be well. And reason as little as possible," he drew out the word possible, "as little as possible," he concluded, again turning to the Count. "That's how we old hussars look at it, and that's all there is to it. And how do you, a young man and a young hussar, how do you judge it?" he added, turning to Nikolai, who, when he heard the war being discussed, had turned away from his partner and was intently listening to the colonel. "I entirely agree with you," replied Nikolai, flushing, turning his plate round, and moving his wine-glass with an air of such desperate resolve that he looked as if it were being exposed to some great danger at that very moment. "I am convinced that we Russians must conquer or die," he said, feeling, as did others after the words were out, that they were too exhausted and bombastic for the present occasion, and consequently inept. "What you said just now was beautiful," Julie remarked with a sigh. Sonia trembled all over with Nikolai when Nikolai spoke. and blushed to her ears and all down her neck and shoulders. Pierre listened to the colonel's speech and nodded approvingly. "That's splendid," he said. "A real hussar, that young man," shouted the colonel, again thumping the table. "What's all the noise about down there?" Marya Detroniva's deep voice was heard from the other end of the table. "What are you thumping the table for?" she demanded of the hussar. "Why so vehement? You must think you're confronting the French." "I'm speaking the truth," said the hussar with a smile. "It's all about the war." The count shouted down the table. "You know, I have a son who's going, Marya Detroniva. My son is going. I've got 4 sons in the army, but I'm not crying about it. It's all in God's hands." "You may die in your bed, or God may spare you in battle," said Marya Detroniva, her deep voice effortlessly carrying the length of the table. "That's true." The conversation subsided and again was concentrated at the ends of the table among the ladies at one end, the men at the other. "You won't ask," Natasha's little brother was saying to her. "There, you see, you won't ask." "I will," retorted Natasha, her face suddenly flushed with joyful, reckless resolve. Half rising with a look that invited Pierre, who sat opposite, to hear what was coming, she turned to her mother. "Mamma!" the resonant childish voice rang out the length of the table. "What is it?" asked the countess, startled. Seeing from her daughter's face that she was up to some mischief, she made an admonitory, disapproving movement of her head and sternly shook a finger at her. There was a lull in the conversation. "Mamma, what are we going to have for dessert?" Natasha's young voice rang out still more clearly and resonantly. The countess tried to frown, but could not. Marya Detroniva shook a fat finger at her. "Cossack," she said threateningly. Most of the guests, not knowing how to take this prank, looked at the elders. "Take care," said the countess. "Mamma, what are we having for dessert?" cried Natasha, audaciously and with pert delight, feeling confident that her prank should be taken in good part. Sonia and plump little Petya were doubled up with laughter. "You see, I did ask," whispered Natasha to her little brother and to Pierre, at whom she glanced once more. "Ice cream, but you won't get any," said Marya Detroniva. Natasha saw that there was nothing to be afraid of, and she braved Marya Detroniva. "Marya Detroniva, what kind of ice cream? I don't like vanilla." "Carrot ice cream." "No." "What kind, Matritina? What kind?" she shrilled. "I want to know." Marya Detroniva and the countess burst out laughing, and all the guests joined in. They laughed not at Matrodivna's answer, but at the incredible daring and cleverness of this little girl, who had the pluck and wit to treat Marya Detroniva in this fashion. Natasha only desisted when she was told that there would be pineapple ice. Before the ices, champagne was served. The orchestra again struck up. The count and the countess kissed, and the guests all rose to congratulate the countess, everyone clinking glasses across the table with the count, the children, and one another. Again, the waiters rushed about, chairs scraped, and in the same order in which they had entered, but with redder faces. The guests returned to the drawing room and the count's study. Chapter 17. The cards tables were brought out and set made up for Boston, and the count's guests settled themselves in the 2 drawing rooms, the sitting room and the library. The count, holding his cards fan-wise and laughing at everything, refrained with difficulty from dropping into his customary after-dinner nap. Prompted by the countess, the young people gathered around the clavichord and the harp. Julie played first by general request, and after playing a little air with variations on the harp, she joined the other young ladies in begging Natasha and Nikolai, who were noted for their musical talent, to sing something. Natasha, though visibly proud of being treated like a grown-up, was none the less shy. "What shall we sing?" she asked. "The Fountain," suggested Nikolai. "Well, let's be quick, Boris. Come here," said Natasha. "But where's Sonia?" She looked about, and seeing that her friend was not in the room, darted off to look for her. After running into Sonia's room and not finding her there, Natasha flew into the nursery. Sonia was not there either. Natasha realized that she must be on the chest in the corridor. This was the place of mourning for the younger generation of females in the Rostov household, and there indeed was Sonia, lying face down on nurse's dirty striped feather bed on top of the chest, crumpling her gossamer pink dress, her face hidden in her hands, and sobbing so that her bare little shoulders shook. Natasha's face, which had been so radiant throughout her name day, suddenly changed. Her eyes became fixed, her throat contracted, and the corners of her mouth drooped. "Sonia, what is it? What is the matter?" "Oh, no!" And not knowing why, except that Sonia was crying, Natasha opened her large mouth so that she could look quite ugly and wailed like a baby. Sonia tried to raise her head and answer, but could not, and buried her face still deeper. Natasha sat down on the blue-striped feather bed, put her arms around her friend, and wept. Pulling herself together with an effort, Sonia sat up and began drying her eyes and explaining. "Nikoleka will be going away in a week. His papers have come. He told me himself. But even so, I shouldn't cry," and she held out a piece of paper with the verses Nikolai had written. "I shouldn't cry, but you can't. No one can understand what a soul he has." And she started crying again, because he had such a beautiful soul. "It's all right for you. I'm not envious. I love you, and Boris too," she said, controlling herself with an effort. "He's nice. There are no obstacles for you, but Nikolai is my cousin, and it would require only the Metropolitan could, otherwise it's impossible. And then if she tells Mama," Sonia looked at the Countess as her mother, "that I'm ruining Nikolai's career, that I'm heartless and ungrateful, when really, as God is my witness," and she crossed herself, "I love her so much, and all of you, except Vera, and what for? What have I done to her? I'm so grateful to you that I should gladly sacrifice everything, only I have nothing." Sonia was unable to go on, and again hid her face in her hands and dropped onto the feather bed. Natasha tried to comfort her, but her face showed that she understood the full gravity of her friend's trouble. "Sonia," she suddenly exclaimed, as if divining the true reason for her cousin's misery, "Vera must have said something to you after dinner, did she?" "Yes, these verses that Nikolai wrote himself, and others that I had copied. She found them on my table, and she said she would show them to Mama, and she even said I was ungrateful, and that Mama would never allow him to marry me, that he was going to marry Julie. And you see how he's been with her all day, Natasha. Why?" And she burst into tears, weeping more bitterly than before. Natasha lifted her up, put her arms around her, and smiling through her tears, began to comfort her. "Sonia, don't believe her, darling. Don't you believe her. Remember how we talked with Nikolai in the sitting room, all three of us. Remember after supper, and we decided how everything was to be. I don't remember now exactly how it was, but you remember, it was so nice and everything was possible. There's Uncle Shinshin's brother married to his first cousin, and we're only second cousins, and Boris says it's quite possible. You know, I told him everything. He's so clever and so good," said Natasha. "Don't cry, Sonia, dearest darling Sonia," she said, kissing her and beginning to laugh. "Vera's spiteful, never mind her. Everything will be all right, and she won't say anything to Mama. Nikolai will tell her himself, and he's never given her thought to Julie." And she kissed her on the head. Sonia sat up. The little kitten came to life. Its eyes sparkled, and it looked as if it was about to jump down on its soft little paws, and with a flick of the tail start playing with a ball as a kitten should. "Do you think so? Really and truly?" she asked, quickly smoothing her dress and hair. "Really and truly," answered Natasha, tucking in a stubborn lock of hair that had come loose from her friend's braid, and they both laughed. "Well, let's go and sing The Fountain. Let's. Do you know that fat Pierre who sat opposite me is so funny," said Natasha, stopping suddenly. "I'm having such a good time." And she ran along the corridor. After shaking up some down that had been clung to her dress and hiding the verses in her bodice next to her bony little chest, Sonia, with flushed face and light, joyous step, ran down the corridor after Natasha to the sitting room. At the visitor's request, the young people sang The Fountain, a quartet with which everyone was delighted. Then Nikolai sang a song that he had just learned. "On a lovely night by the moon's fair glow, what ecstasy to know that someone in the world there'll be who is thinking only of thee. And oh, there the strings of her golden lyre weave fingers that never tire, spinning a rapturous melody that is calling only to thee, to thee. But when paradise at last shall dawn, thy friend, alas, will be gone." He had hardly finished his song when in the ballroom the young people showed signs of getting ready to dance, and the musicians could be heard coughing and tapping their feet in the gallery. Pierre was sitting in the drawing room, where, as a man recently returned from abroad, He was drawn by Shinshin in a political discussion in which several others joined, but which bored Pierre. When the music began, Natasha came into the drawing room and, blushing, her eyes twinkling, went straight up to Pierre and said, "Mamma told me to ask you to join the dancing." "I'm afraid of muddling the figures," said Pierre, "but if you will be my teacher," and bending down to the slender little girl, he offered his stout arm. While the other couples were taking their places and the musicians were turning up, Pierre sat down with his little partner. Natasha was completely happy. She was going to dance with a grown-up, a man who had been abroad, and in view of everyone who was sitting and talking to him like a grown-up lady. In one hand she had a fan that one of the ladies had given her to hold, and assuming the pose of a woman of the world, heaven knows when and where she had learned it, she fanned herself, talking to her partner and smiling at him over the fan. "Now, what do you think of that girl? Just look at her," exclaimed the Countess as she crossed the ballroom. Natasha blushed and laughed. "Well, really, Mamma, what do you say that? Why do you say that? What's so astonishing?" In the middle of the third écosse, there was a scraping of chairs in the drawing room where the Count and Marya Dmitrovna were playing cards with the older and more distinguished guests, and most of them stood up, stretched themselves after sitting so long, put away their purses and pocketbooks, and went into the ballroom. The first to enter were the Count and Marya Dmitrovna, both with jovial countenances, playfully ceremonious in the kind of mock ballad style. The Count offered a bent arm to Marya Dmitrovna. He drew himself up, his face glowing with a smile of debonair gallantry, and as soon as the last figure of the écosse was over, clapped his hands to the musicians in the gallery and shouted up to the first violin, "Semyon, do you know the Daniel Kupa?" This was the Count's favorite dance, one he had danced in his youth. Properly speaking, the Daniel Cooper was one figure of the Allegres. "Look at Papa," Natasha shouted to the whole company, quite forgetting that she was dancing with a grown-up, and doubling over till her curly hair touched her knees. She filled the room with her ringing laughter, and indeed everyone smiled with delight at the jolly old gentleman standing beside his majestic partner. Marya Dmitrovna was taller than he, as he threw back his shoulders, held out his bent arms, and beat time with them, turned out his toes, and lightly tapped with one foot, while the expansive smile that made his round face even broader prepared the spectators for what was to come. As soon as the brisk, rousing strains of the Daniel Cooper, somewhat resembling a merry country dance, was heard, all the doorways of the ballroom were filled with domestic serfs, the men on one side and the women on the other, who with beaming faces had come to see their mastery making merry. "Just look at the master, a regular eagle," exclaimed the old nurse in a loud voice from one of the doorways. The Count danced well and knew it, but his partner neither could nor cared to dance well. Her enormous figure stood erect, her stout arms hung at her sides. She had handed her reticule to the Countess, and only her stern, handsome face took part in the dance. What in the Count was expressed in this whole rotund figure, in Marya Dmitrovna found expression only in her ever-broadening smile and her twitching nose. But if the Count captivated his audience by the unexpectedness of his nimble turns and light-footed capers, Marya Dmitrovna, without the least exertion, produced no less an effect by dint of moving her shoulders, bending her arms when turning, or stamping her foot, which everyone appreciated in view of her portliness and her customary severity. The dance grew more and more lively. The other couples were quite unnoticed and made no effort to attract attention to themselves. All were absorbed in watching the Count and Marya Dmitrovna. Natasha kept tugging everyone by the sleeve or dress, quite needlessly, as no one could take his eyes off the dancing couple, and urging them to look at Papa. In the intervals of the dance, the Count, breathing heavily, waved and shouted to the musicians to play faster, faster and faster. More and more deftly he whirled pirouetted around his partner, now on his toes, now on his heels, until at last, turning her around to her place, he executed the final pass, and lightly kicking one foot up behind, bowed his perspiring head with a smile and a broad sweep of his arm amid a roar of laughter and applause, and above all Natasha's. Both partners stood still, breathing heavily and mopping their faces with cambric handkerchiefs. "That's how we used to dance in our day, mon cher," said the Count. "Now that was a Daniel Cooper," said Marya Dmitrovna, letting out a deep breath and tucking up her sleeves. Chapter 18. While in the Rustos ballroom and six agles was being danced to music that the weary musicians were no longer able to play without false notes, and tired cooks and footmen were preparing supper, Count Besakouf had his sixth stroke. The doctors announced that there was no hope of recovery. After a mute confession, Holy Communion was administered to the dying man, and preparations were being made for the sacrament of the anointing. In the house there was the bustle and suspense usual at such moments, and outside, beyond the gates, and trying to keep out of sight of the carriages that drove up, a group of undertakers had congregated in the anticipation of an order for the Count's sumptuous funeral. The Governor-General of Moscow, who had been continually sending his adjutants to inquire about the Count's condition, came himself that evening to bid at last farewell to the celebrated grandee of the Empress Catherine's court. The magnificent reception room was crowded. Everyone stood up respectfully when the Governors-General, after spending almost half an hour alone with the sick man, came out, and with scant acknowledgment of their bows, tried to escape as quickly as possible from the looks fixed on him by the doctors, clergymen, and relations. Prince Vasily, who had grown thinner and paler during the last few days, escorted him to the doctor, repeating something to him several times in a low voice. When he had seen the Governor-General out, Prince Vasily sat down alone on a chair in the hall, crossed his legs, and leaning an elbow on his knee, covered his eyes with his hand. After sitting there for some time, he got up, glanced about him with frightened eyes, and proceeded with unaccustomed haste down the long corridor leading to the back part of the house, to the apartments of the eldest princess. Those who were there in the dimly lit reception room talked among themselves in intimate whispers, falling silent and looking up with eyes full of inquiry and suspense every time the door leading to the dying man's room creaked and someone went in or out. "The term of human life is fixed," said another little cleric to the lady who had sat down beside him and was naively listening to his words. "The term is fixed, and there is no o'erstepping to it." "I wonder, isn't it too late for the anointing?" inquired the lady, adding his clerical title and speaking as if she herself had no opinion on the subject. "An awesome sacrament, ma'am," replied the cleric, passing his hand over the sparse grizzled strands of her hair carefully combed over his bald head. "Who was that? The Governor-General himself?" someone at the other end of the room was asking. "What a young-looking man! And he's over 60. Did they say that the Count no longer recognizes anyone? Were they preparing for the anointing?" "I knew someone who received that sacrament 7 times. The second princess came out of the sick man's room, her eyes red from weeping, and sat down beside Dr. Lorraine, who had seated himself under a portrait of the Empress Catherine in a grateful attitude with his elbow on the table. "Trust Bew," said the doctor in reply to a question about the weather. "Trust Bew, princess, and besides, in Moscow one feels as if one were in the country." "Isn't it true?" the princess responded with a sigh. "So may he have something to drink," Lorraine explained. Considered. "Has he taken in his medicine?" "Yes." The doctor glanced at his watch. "Take a glass of boiled water, and put in a pinch," he indicated with delicate fingers what he meant by a pinch, "of cream of tartar." "A case there has never been," said a German doctor to an adjutant, "of a man the 3rd stroke surviving." "What a robust man he was," remarked the adjutant. "And to whom will this great wealth go?" he added in a whisper. "There will be candidates found," replied the German with a smile. Everyone again looked toward the doctor, which creaked as the second princess went in to the sick man with the drink she had prepared according to Lorraine's instructions. The German doctor approached Lorraine. "Is it still possible that he can through the night last?" asked the German in abominable French. Lorraine pursed his lips and waved a finger before his nose in stern negation. "Tonight, not later," he said in a low voice, and with a decorous smile of satisfaction at being able clearly to understand and state the patient's condition. He walked away. Meanwhile, Prince Vasily had opened the door to the princess's room, which was in semi-darkness. Only 2 icon lamps burned before the icons, and there was a pleasant scent of incense and flowers. The room was filled with diminutive pieces of furniture, little tables, chiffoniers, and whatnots. Behind the screen, the white coverings of a high feathered bed could be seen. A little dog began to bark. Ah, is that you, mon cousin? The princess got up and smoothed her hair, which always, and even now, was extraordinarily smooth, that it appeared to be made of one piece with her head and the core. What is it? Has something happened? She asked. I am in a constant state of alarm. No, there is no change. I have only come to have a talk with you, Katish, about business, the prince murmured, wearily sitting down on a chair. The princess had just vacated. You certainly keep this room warm, he observed. Come, sit down. Let us talk. I thought perhaps something had happened, said the princess, and with her unchanging, stonily severe expression, she sat down opposite the prince, prepared to listen. I have been trying to get some sleep, mon cousin, but I can't. Well, my dear, said Prince Vasily, taking her hand and bending it downward, as with his habit. It was plain that this well referred to much that was understood between them without being put into words. The princess, her disproportionately long-waisted body held rigid, looked directly at the prince with no sign of emotion in her protuberant grey eyes. She shook her head and, sighing, looked at the icon. Her gesture might have been interrupted as an expression of sorrow and devotion, or as a weariness and hope of a speedy respite. Prince Vasily took it as an expression of weariness. And do you think is it any easier for me? He asked. I'm as worn out as a post horse, nevertheless. I must have a talk with you, Kadish, a very serious talk. Prince Vasily said no more, and his cheeks commenced twitching nervously, first on one side, then on the other, giving his face an unpleasant expression that was never seen on it in drawing-rooms. His eyes, too, seemed different, at one moment looking insolently jocular, at the next glancing round in trepidation. The princess, holding the little dog on her lap with her thin, dry hands, gazed attentively into Prince Vasily's eyes, and it was obvious that she would not break the silence with a question if she had to sit there till morning. You see, my dear princess and cousin Katerina Semyonovna, the prince proceeded, apparently not without an inner struggle, at moments such as these one must think of everything. One must think of the future and of you. I love all of you as if you were my own children, you know that. The princess did not alter his dull, fixed gaze. And of course, my family too has to be considered, Prince Vasily continued, irascibly pushing away a little table and avoiding her eyes. You know, Kadish, that you, three Mamatov sisters and my wife are the Count's only direct heirs. I know how painful it is for you to talk or think of such matters. It's no easier for me, but my dear friend, I'm in my 50s, and I must be prepared for anything. Do you know that I have sent for Pierre, that the Count, pointing straight at his portrait, demanded to see him? Prince Vasily looked inquiringly at the princess, but he could not make out whether she was considering what he had just said or was simply staring at him. The one thing I never cease praying for, mon cousin, she replied, is that God will have mercy on him and allow his noble soul peacefully to leave this. Yet, quite so, Prince Vasily interrupted impatiently, rubbing his bald head and irately pulling toward him the little table he had just pushed away. But actually, the fact is, as you yourself know, last winter the Count made a will by which, passing over us, his direct heirs, he left all his property to Pierre. No matter what the will says, the princess placidly stated, Pierre cannot inherit the estate. Pierre is illegitimate. But monsieur, said Prince Vasily suddenly, clutching the little table and beginning to speak more rapidly as became more intent. What if a letter had been written to the emperor in which the Count asked that Pierre be legitimized? You understand that in view of the Count's services, his request would be respected. The princess smiled as people do who think they know more about a subject than those they are talking with. I'll tell you something more, continued Prince Vasily, seizing her hand. Although the letter was written, it was not sent, but the emperor knows about it. The only question is, has it been destroyed or not? If not, then as soon as all is over, the prince sighed, giving her to understand what he meant by the words all over is over, and the Count's papers are open. The will, along with this letter, will be delivered to the emperor, and the petition will certainly be granted. Pierre, as his legitimate son, will get everything. And our share, inquired the princess, smiling ironically, as if anything but that were possible. Mas pa paro katish. It's clear as day. He will then be the sole legal heir to everything, and you won't receive so much as that. You, my dear, ought to know whether the will and the letter were written, and whether or not they have been destroyed. And if they have somehow been overlooked, then you must know where they are, and must find them, because— That is going too far, the princess interrupted with a sardonic smile, but with no change in the expression of her eyes. I am a woman, and though you think we are all stupid, I know this much. And an illegitimate son cannot inherit un bâtard, she added, presuming that by this translation of the word she would prove conclusively to the prince the invalidity of his contention. Why is it you can't understand Kaddish? You are so intelligent. Why can't you understand that if the count has written a letter to the emperor appealing to him to recognize his son as legitimate, it follows that Pierre is no longer Pierre, but Count Besakov, and by the terms of the will inherit everything? And if the will and letter have not been destroyed, then you will be left with nothing but the consolation of having virtuously performed your duty, and whatever may ensue therefrom. That is certain. I know that the will was made, but I also know that it is invalid, and you, my cousin, appear to consider me an utter fool, said the princess with the expression women have when they think they are saying something witty and caustic. My dear Princess Katerina Semyonovna, Prince Vasily began impatiently, I came here not to bicker with you, but to talk to you as to a kinsman, a good, kind, and true relation, about your own interest, and I tell you for the 10th time that if the letter to the emperor and the will in Pierre's favor are among the count's papers, you, my dear girl, and your sisters are not heiresses. If you don't believe me, then believe the experts. I have just been talking to Dmitri Arnovitch. This was the family lawyer, and he says exactly the same. There was evidently a sudden change in the princess's thinking. Her thin lips paled, her eyes remained the same, and with a vehemence that surprised herself, she snapped, That would be just fine. I never wanted anything and I don't know. She pushed the little dog off her lap and smoothed the folds of her dress. This is gratitude. This is what people get who have sacrificed everything for him, she said. Splendid. Fine. I want nothing, Prince. Yes, but you are not alone. You have sisters, the prince rejoined. But the princess was not listening. Yes, I knew this long ago, but had forgotten. I know that in his house, apart from meanness, deceit, envy, intrigue, ingratitude, and blackest ingratitude, I could expect nothing. Do you or do you not know where that will is? The prince asked, his cheeks twitching more than ever. Yes, I was stupid. I believed in people, loved them, sacrificed myself for them, but only the base, the vile succeeded. I know who intrigues these are. The princess tried to get up, but the prince held her by the hand. She had the look of a person who had suddenly become disillusioned with the whole human race. She gave her companion a malevolent look. This is still time. This is still time, my friend. Remember, Katish, that it was all done fortuitously in a moment of anger, of illness, and then forgotten. Our duty, my dear, is to rectify this mistake, to lighten his moments by not letting him commit this injustice, by not letting him die with the thought that he was made miserable. Those who have sacrificed everything for him, chimed in the princess, who again would have risen had not the prince held her fast, which is something he could never appreciate. No, mon cousin, she added with a sigh, I shall always remember that in this world one can expect no reward, that in this world there is neither honor nor justice. In this world one has to be cunning and wicked. Come now, compose yourself. I know what a good heart you have. No, I have a wicked heart. I know your heart, repeated the prince. I value your friendship, and I should like you to have the same opinion of me. Don't upset yourself, and let us talk sensibly while there is still time. It may be a day, it may be an hour. Tell me all you know about the will, and above all, where it is. You must know. We will take it all at once and show you to the count. He has unquestionably forgotten about it, and we will wish to destroy it. You understand that my one desire is the strict fulfillment of his wishes. This is my only reason for coming here. I came solely to help him and you. I see it all now. I know whose intrigues these are. I know, said the princess, That is not the point, my love. It's the protege of yours, the charming Anna Mikhailova, who I wouldn't want as a housemaid, the detestable Losov woman. We are wasting time. Oh, don't talk to me. Last winter she worn her way in here and told the Count such vile, outrageous things about us, especially about Sophie. I couldn't repeat them, that it made the Count quite ill, and for 2 weeks he wouldn't see us. It was at that time, I know, that he wrote that filthy, odious document, but I thought it was no importance. Now we come to the point. Why did you say nothing to me of this before? It's in the inlaid portfolio he keeps under his pillow. Now I know, the princess went on, ignoring his question, and if I have a sin to account for, a great sin, it is hatred of that vile woman. She almost shouted, completely transformed. And why does she insulate herself in here? I'll have it out with her. The time has come. And I'm going to leave it off there. Thank you so much for watching the video. Please give it a thumbs up if you like it, or a thumbs down. Leave a comment below down here. Subscribe. Hit the subscribe button if you want to subscribe. Or if not, just keep watching. And I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.